Yo, what up? Um, I'm live today mostly because I don't feel like filming, so that's cool. Um, but pretty much what we're going to be doing is reading another chapter of Anarchism, Peter Kropotkin, wonderful book. And then we'll just do like some chill Q&A stuff. I don't know. But yeah, again, mostly doing this because I'm an authority. Um, it's a fun one. It's actually one of the first essays I ever read by Kropotkin. I fell in love with it, so I hope you guys enjoy. Yeah. When ignorance reigns in society and disorder in the minds of men, laws are multiplied, legislation is expected to do everything, and each fresh law being a fresh miscalculation, men are continually led to demand from it what can proceed only from themselves, from their own education and their own morality. It is no revolutionist to say this, not even a reformer. It is the jurist, Dalloy, author of the collection of French law known as the Repertoire de la Législation. And yet, though these lines were written by a man who was himself a maker and admirer of the law, they perfectly represent the abnormal condition of our society. In existing states, a fresh law is looked upon as a remedy for evil. Instead of themselves altering what is bad, people begin by demanding a law to alter it. If the road between two villages is impassable, the peasant says, there should be a law about parish roads. If a park keeper takes advantage of the want of spirit in those who follow him with servile observance and insults one of them, the insulted man says, there should be a law to enjoin more politeness upon park keepers. If there is stagnation in agriculture or commerce, the husbandman, cattle breeder, or corn speculator argues, it is protective legislation that we require. Down to the old craftsman, there is not one who does not demand the law to protect his own little trade. If the employer lowers wages or increases the labors of hour, the politician in embryo exclaims, we must have a law to put all that to rights. In short, a law everywhere and for everything. A law about fashions, a law about mad dogs, a law about virtue, a law to put a stop to all the vices and all the evils which result from human indolence and cowardice. We are so perverted by an education which from infancy seeks to kill in us the spirit of revolt, and to develop that submission to authority. We are so perverted by this existence under the fair rule of law, which regulates every event in life, our birth, our education, our development, our love, our friendship, that if this state of things continues, we shall lose all initiative, all habit of thinking for ourselves. Our society seems no longer able to understand that it is possible to exist otherwise than under the reign of law, elaborated a represented government and administered by a handful of rulers. And even when it has gone so far as to emancipate itself from the thraldom, its first care has been to reconstitute it immediately. The year one of liberty has never lasted more than a day, for after proclaiming it, men put themselves the very next morning under the yoke of law and authority. Indeed, for some thousands of years, those who govern us have done nothing but ring the changes upon respect for law, obedience to authority. This is the moral atmosphere in which parents bring up their children, and school only serves to confirm the impression. Cleverly assorted scraps of spurious science are inculcated upon the children to prove the necessity of law. Obedience to the law is made a religion. Moral goodness and the law of the masters are fused into one and the same divinity. The historical hero of the schoolroom is the man who obeys the law and defends it against rebels. Later, when we enter upon public life, society, and literature, impressing us day by day and hour by hour as the water drop hollows the stone, continue to inculcate the same prejudice. Books of history, of political science, of social economy are stuffed with this respect for law. Even the physical sciences have been pressed into the service by introducing artificial modes of expression, borrowed from theology or arbitrary power, into knowledge which is purely the result of observation. Thus, our intelligence is successfully befogged, and always to maintain our respect for law. The same work is done by newspapers. They have not an article which does not preach respect for law, even where the third page proved every single day the imbecility of that law, and shows how it is dragged through every variety of mud and filth by those charged with its administration. Servility before the law has become a virtue, and I doubt if there were ever a revolutionist who did not begin in his youth as a defender of law against what are generally called abuses, although the last are inevitable consequences of the law itself. Art pipes in unison with would-be science. The hero of the sculpture, the painter, the musician shields law beneath his buckler, and with flashing eyes and distended nostrils stands ever ready to strike down the man who would lay hands upon her. Temples are raised to her. Revolutionists themselves hesitate to touch the high priest consecrated to her service. And when revolution is about to sweep away some ancient institution, it is still by law that it endeavors to sanctify the deed. The confused mass of rulers of conduct called law, which has been bequeathed to us by slavery, serfdom, feudalism, and royalty, has taken the place of those stone monsters before whom human victims used to be immolated, and whom slavish savages dared not even touch, lest they be slayed by the thunderbolts of heaven. This new worship has been established with a special success since the rise of supreme power of the Middle Ages, since the Great French Revolution. Under the ancient regime, men spoke little of laws, unless indeed it were with Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire, to oppose them to royal caprice. Obedience to the good pleasure of the king and his lackeys was compulsory, on pain of hanging or imprisonment. But during and after the revolutions, when lawyers rose to power, they did their best to strengthen the principle upon which their ascendancy depended. The middle class at once accepted it as a dike to dam up the popular torrent. The priestly crew hastened to sanctify it, to save their bark from foundering amid the breakers. Finally, the people received it as an improvement upon the arbitrary authority and violence of the past. To understand this, we must transport ourselves in imagination to the 18th century. Our hearts must have ached at the story of the atrocities committed by all-powerful nobles at the time upon the men and women of the people before we can understand what must have been the magic influence upon the present peasant's mind of the words equality before the law, obedience to the law without distinction of birth or fortune. He who, until then, had been treated more cruelly than a beast, he who had never any rights, he who had never obtained justice against the most revolting actions on the part of the noble, unless in revenge he killed him and was hanged, he saw himself recognized by this maxim, at least in theory, and, at least with regard to his personal rights, as the equal to the Lord. Whatever this law might be, it promised to affect the lord and peasant alike. It proclaimed the equality of rich and poor before the judge. The promise was a lie, and today we know it, but at that period it was an advance. An homage to justice, a hypocrisy is a homage rendered to the truth. This is the lesson that when the saviors of the menaced middle class, the Robespierres and Dantons, took their stand upon the writings of the Rousseaus and the Voltaires, proclaimed respect for the law, the same for every man. The people accepted the compromise, for the revolutionary impetus had already spent its force in the contest with a foe whose ranks drew closer day by day. They bowed their neck beneath the yoke of law to save themselves from the arbitrary power of their lords. The middle class has ever since continued to make the most of this maxim, with which another principle, that of representative government, sums up the whole philosophy of the bourgeois age, the 19th century. It has preached this doctrine in schools, it has propagated it in its writings, it has molded its art and science to the same purpose, it has thrust its belief into every hole and corner, like a pious Englishwoman who slips tracts under the door, and it has done all this so successfully that today we behold the issue in the detestable fact that men who long for freedom begin the attempt to obtain it by entreating their masters to be kind enough to protect them by modifying the laws which these masters themselves have created. But times and tempers have changed. Rebels are everywhere to be found who no longer wish to obey the law without knowing whence it comes, what are its uses, and whither arises the obligation to submit to it, and the reverence with which it is encompassed. The rebels of our day are criticizing the very foundations of society which have hitherto been held sacred, and first and foremost among them that fetish, law. The critics analyze the sources of law and find they're either a god, product of the terrors of the savage, and stupid, paltry, and malicious as the priests who vouch for its supernatural origin, or else bloodshed, conquest by fire and sword. They study the characteristics of law, and instead of perpetual growth corresponding to that of the human race, they find its distinctive trait to be immobility, a tendency to crystallize what should be modified and developed day by day. They ask how law has been maintained, and in its service they see the atrocities of Byzantinism, the cruelties of the Inquisition, the tortures of the Middle Ages, living flesh torn by the lash of the executioner, chains, clubs, axes, the gloomy dungeons of prison, agony, curses, and tears. In our own days they see, as before, the axe, the cord, the rifle, the prison. On the one hand, the brutalized prisoner, reduced to the condition of a caged beast by the debasement of his whole moral being, and on the other, the judge, stripped of every feeling which does honor to human nature, living like a visionary in a world of legal fictions, reveling in the infliction of imprisonment and death, without even suspecting, in the cold malignity of his madness, the abyss of degradation into which he himself has fallen before the eyes of those whom he condemns. They see a race of lawmakers legislating without knowing what their laws are about. Today, voting on a law on the sanitization of towns without the faintest notion of hygiene. Tomorrow, making regulations for the armament of troops without so much as understanding a gun. Making laws about teaching and education without ever having given a lesson of any sort, or even an honest education to their own children. Legislating at random in all directions, but never forgetting the penalties to be meted out to ragamuffins, the prison, and the galleys, which are to be the portion of men 1,000 times less immoral than these legislators themselves. Finally, they see the jailer on the way to lose all human feeling, the detective trained as a bloodhound, the police spy despising himself, informing, metamorphosed into a virtue, corruption erected into a system, all the vices, all the evil qualities of mankind, countenanced and cultivated to ensure the triumph of law. All this we see, and therefore, instead of innately repeating this old formula, respect the law, we say despise law and all its attributes. In place of the cowardly phrase, obey the law, our cry is revolt against all laws. Only compare the misdeeds accomplished in the name of each law with the good it has been able to effect, and weigh carefully both good and evil, and you will see if we are right. That's the first part of that chapter. We're going to go on. Again, this is Anarchism by Pyotr Kropotkin, reading Law and Authority. One thing that just really strikes me about this essay is how much it parallels to modern day. Like what he said in that last page about like legislators writing laws about things that they themselves have never even encountered. Like that's real life, especially when he says like making laws about teaching and education without ever having given a lesson of any sort. Like that's a direct parallel to literally today. So I find that to be just incredible. Anyway, we're gonna go on. Part 2. Relatively speaking, law is a product of modern times. For ages and ages, mankind lived without any written law, even that graved in symbols upon the entrance stones of a temple. During that period, human relations were simply regulated by customs, habits, and usages, made sacred by constant repetition, and acquired by each person in childhood, exactly as he learned how to obtain his food by hunting, cattle rearing, or agriculture. All human societies have passed through this primitive phase, and to this day a large proportion of mankind have no written law. Every tribe has its own manners and customs, customary law, as the jurists say. It has social habits, and that suffices to maintain cordial relations between the inhabitants of the village, the members of the tribe or community, even amongst ourselves, the civilized nations. When we leave large towns and go into the country, we see that the mutual relations of the inhabitants are still regulated according to ancient and generally accepted customs, and not according to the written law of the legislators. The peasants of Russia, Italy, and Spain, and even of a large part of France and England have no conception of written law. It only meddles with their lives to regulate the reactions with the state. to regulate their relations with the state. As to relations between themselves, though these are sometimes very complex, they are simply regulated according to ancient custom. Formerly, this was the case with mankind in general. Two distinctly marked currents of customs are revealed by analysis by the usages of primitive people. As man does not live in a solitary state, habits and feelings develop within him which are useful for the preservation of society and the propagation of the race. Without social feelings and usages, life in common would have been absolutely impossible. It is not a law which has established them. They are all anterior to all law. Neither is it religion which has ordained them. They are interior to all religions. They are found amongst all animals living in society. They are spontaneously developed by the very nature of things, like those habits in animals which men call instinct. They spring from a process of evolution, which is useful and indeed necessary to keep society together in the struggle it is forced to maintain for existence. Savages end by no longer eating one another because they find in the long run more advantageous to devote themselves to some sort of cultivation than to enjoy the pleasure of feasting upon the flesh of an aged relative once a year. Many travelers have depicted the manners of absolutely independent tribes, where laws and chiefs are unknown, but where the members of the tribe have given up stabbing one another in every dispute, because the habit of living in society has ended by developing certain feelings of fraternity and oneness of interest, and they prefer appealing to a third person to settle their differences. The hospitality of primitive peoples, respect for human life, the sense of reciprocal obligation, compassion for the weak, courage, and extending even to the sacrifice of self for others, which is first learned of the sake of children and friends, and later for that of members of the same community. All these qualities are developed in man anterior to all law, independently of all religion, as in the case of the social animals. Such feelings and practices are the inevitable results of social life. Without being, as say some priests and metaphysicians, inherent in man, such qualities are the consequence of life in common. But side by side with these customs, necessary to the life of societies and the preservation of the race, other desires, other passions, and therefore other habits and customs are evolved in human association. The desire to dominate others and impose one's own will upon them, the desire to seize upon the products of the labor of a neighboring tribe, the desire to surround oneself with comforts without producing anything, while slaves provide their master with the means of procuring every sort of pleasure and luxury. These selfish personal desires give rise to another current of habits and customs. The priest and the warrior, the charlatan who makes a profit out of superstition, and after freeing himself from the fear of the devil cultivates it in others, and the bully, who procures the invasion and pillage of his villages, that he may return laden with booty and followed by slaves. These two, hand in hand, have succeeded in imposing upon primitive society customs advantageous to both of them, but tending to perpetuate their domination of the masses. Profiting by the indolence, the fear, the inertia of the crowd, and thanks to the continual repetition of the same acts, they have permanently established customs which have become a solid basis for their own domination. For this purpose, they would have made use, in the first place, of that tendency to run in a groove, so highly developed in mankind. In children and all savages it attains striking proportion, and it may also be observed in animals. Man, when he is at all superstitious, is always afraid to introduce any sort of change into existing conditions. He generally venerates what is ancient. Our fathers did so and so. They got on pretty well. They brought you up. They were not unhappy. Do the same, the old say to the young, every time the latter wishes to alter things. The unknown frightens them. They prefer to cling to the past, even when that past represents poverty, oppression, and slavery. It may even be said that the more miserable a man is, the more he dreads every sort of change, lest it may make him more wretched still. Some ray of hope, a few scraps of comfort, may penetrate his gloomy abode before he can begin to desire better things, to criticize the old way of living, and to prepare to imperil, though, for the sake of bringing about a change. So long as he is not imbued with hope, so long as he is not freed from the tutelage of those who utilize his superstition and his fears, he prefers remaining in his former position. If the young desire any change, the old raise a cry of alarm against the innovators. Some savages would rather die than transgress the customs of their country, because they have been told from childhood that the least infraction of established routine would bring ill luck and ruin the whole tribe. Even in the present day, what numbers of politicians, economists, and would-be revolutionists act under the same impression and cling to a vanishing past. How many care only to seek for precedents? How many fiery innovators are mere copyists of bygone revolutions? The spirit of routine, originating in superstition, indolence, and cowardice, has in all times been the mainstay of oppression. In primitive human societies, it was cleverly turned to account by priests and military chiefs. They perpetuated customs useful only to themselves, and succeeded in imposing them upon the whole tribe. So long as this conservative spirit could be exploited so as to assure the chief his encroachments upon individual liberty, so long as the only inequalities between men were the work of nature, and these were not increased by 100-fold by the concentration of power and wealth, there was no need for law and the formidable paraphernalia of tribunals and ever-augmentating penalties to enforce it. But as society became more and more divided into two hostile classes, one seeking to establish its domination, the other struggling to escape, the strife began. Now the conqueror was in hurry to secure the results of his actions in a permanent form. He tried to place them beyond question, to make them holy and venerable by every means in his power. Law made its appearance under the sanction of the priest, and the warrior's club was placed at its service. Its office was to render immutable such customs as were to the advantage of the dominant minority. Military authority undertook to ensure obedience. This new function was a fresh guarantee to the power of the warrior. Now he had not only mere brute force at his service, he was the defender of the law. If law, however, presented nothing but a collection of prescriptions serviceable to rulers, it would find some difficulty in ensuring acceptance and obedience. While the legislators confounded in one code and two currents of custom, which we have just been speaking, the maxims which represent principles of morality and social union wrought out as the result of life in common, and the mandates which are meant to ensure external existence to inequality. Customs, absolutely essential to the very being of society, are, in the code, cleverly intermingled with the usage imposed by the ruling caste, and both claim equal respect from the crowd. Do not kill, says the code, and hastens to add and pay tithes to the priest. Do not steal, says the code, and immediately after, he who refuses to pay taxes shall have his hand struck off. Such was the law, and it has maintained its twofold character to this day. Its origin is the desire of the ruling class to give permanence to customs imposed by themselves for their own advantage. Its character is the skillful commingling of customs useful to society, customs which have no need of law to ensure respect, with other customs only useful to rulers, the injurious to the mass of people, and maintained only by the fear of punishments. Like individual capital, which was born of fraud and violence, and developed under the auspices of authority, law has no title to the respect of men. Born of violence and superstition, and established in the interest of the consumer, priest, and rich exploiter, it must be utterly destroyed on the day when people desire to break their chains. We shall be better convinced of this when later we shall have analyzed the ulterior development of laws under the auspices of religion, authority, and the existing parliamentary system. Alright, so that was part 2. We're going to move into part 3 in just a sec. Again, this is Pyotr Kropotkin, Anarchism, and we're reading the essay, Law and Authority. Okay, part 3. We have seen how law originated in established usage and custom, and how from the beginning it has represented a skillful mixture of social habits, necessary to the preservation of the human race, with other customs imposed by those who have used popular superstition, as well as the right of the strongest for their own advantage. This double character of law has determined its own later development during the growth of political organization. While in the course of ages, the nucleus of social custom inscribed in law has been subjected to but slight and gradual modifications, the other portion has been largely developed in directions indicated by the interests of the dominant class, and to the injury of the classes they oppress. From time to time, these dominant classes have allowed a law to be extorted from them which presented, or appeared to present, some guarantee for the disinherited. But then such laws have but repealed a previous law, made for the advantage of the ruling class. The best laws, says Buckle, were those which repealed the preceding ones. But what terrible efforts have been needed, what rivers of blood have been spilled, every time there has been a question of the repeal of one of these fundamental enactments serving to hold the people in fetters, before she could abolish the last vestiges of serfdom and feudal rights, and break up the power of the royal court. France was forced to pass through 4 years of revolution and 20 years of war. Decades of conflict are needed to repeal the least of the iniquitous laws bequeathed to us by the past, and even then they scarcely disappear except in periods of revolution. The history of the genesis of capital has already been told by socialists many times. They've described how it was born of war and pillage, of slavery and serfdom, of modern fraud and exploitation. They have shown how it is nourished by the blood of the worker, and how little by little it has conquered the whole world. The same story concerning the genesis and development of law has yet to be told. As usual, the popular intelligence has stolen a march upon men of the books. It has already put together the philosophy of this history, and is busy laying down its essential landmarks. Law, in its quality of guarantee of the results of pillage, slavery, and exploitation, has followed the same phases of development as capital. Twin brother and sister, they have advanced hand in hand, sustaining one another with the suffering of mankind. In every country in Europe, their history is approximately the same. It is only different in detail. The main facts are alike, and to glance at the development of law in France or Germany is to know its essential traits and its phases of development in most of the European nations. In the first instance, law was a national pact or contract. It is true this contract was not always freely accepted. Even in the early days, the rich and strong were opposing their will upon the rest. But at all events, they encountered an obstacle to their encroachments in the mass of the people, who often made them feel their power in return. But as the church on one side and the nobles on the other succeeded in enthralling the people, the right of lawmaking escaped from the hands of the nation and passed into those of the privileged orders. Fortified by the wealth accumulating in her coffers, the church extended her authority. She tampered more and more with private life, and under the pretext of saving souls, seized upon the labor of her serfs. She gathered taxes from every class. She increased her jurisdiction. She multiplied penalties. She enriched herself in proportion to the number of offenses committed, for the produce of every fine poured into her coffers. Law had no longer any connection with the interests of the nation. They might have been supposed to emanate rather from a council of religious fanatics than from legislators, observes a historian of French law. At the same time, as the baron likewise extended his authority over laborers in the fields and artisans in the towns, he too became legislator and judge. The few relics of national law dating from the 10th century are merely agreements regulating service, statute, labor, and tribute due from serfs and vassals to their lord. The legislators of that period were a handful of brigands organized for the plunder of a people daily becoming more peaceful as they applied themselves to agricultural pursuits. These robbers exploited the feelings for justice inherent in the people. They posed as the administrators of that justice, made a source of revenue for themselves out of its fundamental principles, and concocted laws to maintain their own domination. Later on, these laws, collected and classified by jurists, formed the foundation of our modern codes. Are we to talk about respecting these codes, the legacy of baron and priest? The first revolution, the revolt of the townships, was successful in abolishing only a portion of these laws. The charters of enfranchised towns are, for most part, a mere compromise between baronial and episcopal legislation, and the new relations created within the free borough itself. Yet, what a difference between these laws and the laws we have now. The town did not take upon itself to imprison and execute citizens for reasons of the state. It was content to expel anyone who had plotted with enemies of the city, and to raze his house to the ground. It confined itself to imposing fines for so-called crimes and misdemeanors, and in the townships of the 12th century may even be discerned to the just principle today forgotten, which holds the whole community responsible for the misdoing of each of its members. The societies of that time looked upon crime as an accident or misfortune, a conception common among the Russian peasantry at this moment. Therefore, they did not admit of the principle of personal vengeance as preached by the Bible, but considered that the blame for each misdeed reverted to the whole society. It needed all the influence of the Byzantine Church, which imported into the West the refined cruelties of Eastern despotism. It introduced into the manners of Gauls and Germans the penalty of death, and the horrible tortures afterwards inflicted on those regarded as criminals. Just in the same way, it needed all the influence of the Roman Code, the product of the corruption of imperial Rome, to introduce the notions as to absolute property in land, which have overthrown the communistic customs of primitive people. As we know, the free townships were not able to hold their own. Torn by internal dissensions between rich and poor, borrower and serf, they fell an easy prey to royalty. And as royalty acquired fresh strength, the right of legislation passed more and more into the hands of a clique of courtiers. Appeal to the nation was made only to sanction the taxes demanded by the king. Parliaments summoned at intervals of 2 centuries, according to the good pleasure or caprice of the court, councils extraordinary, assemblies of notables, ministers scarce heeding the grievances of the king's subjects. These are the legislators of France. Later still, when all power is concentrated in a single man, who can say, I am the state? Edicts are concocted in the secret councils of the prince, according to the whim of a minister or of an imbecile king, and subjects must obey on pain of death. All judicial guarantees are abolished. The nation is the serf of royalty and of a handful of courtiers. And at this period, the most horrible penalties startle our gaze. The wheel, the stake, flaying alive, torture of every description, invented by the sick fancy of monks and madmen, seeking delight in the sufferings of executed criminals. The Great Revolution began the demolition of this framework of law, bequeathed to us by feudalism and royalty. But after having demolished some portions of the ancient edifice, the Revolution delivered over the power of lawmaking to the bourgeoisie, who in their turn began to raise a fresh framework of laws intended to maintain and perpetuate middle-class domination among the masses. Their parliament makes laws right and left, and mountains of law accumulate with frightful rapidity. But what are all these laws at bottom? A major portion have but one object: to protect private property, i.e., wealth acquired by the exploitation of man by man. Their aim is to open out to capital fresh fields for exploitation, and to sanction the new forms which that exploitation continually assumes, as capital swallows up another branch of human activity: railways, telegraphs, electric light, chemical industries, the expression of man's thought in literature and science, etc. The object of the rest of these laws is fundamentally the same. They exist to keep up the machinery of the government, which serves to secure to capital the exploitation and monopoly of the wealth produced. Magistrature, police, army, public instruction, finance, all serve one God, capital. All have but one object: to facilitate the exploitation of the worker by the capitalist. Analyze all the laws passed, and you will find nothing but this: the protection of the person, which is put forward as the true mission of the law, occupies an imperceptible space among them, for in existing society, assaults upon the person directly dictated by hatred and brutality tend to disappear. Nowadays, if anyone is murdered, it is generally for sake of robbing him, rarely because of personal vengeance. But if this class of crimes and misdemeanors is continually diminishing, we certainly do not owe the change to legislation. It is due to the growth of humanitarianism in our societies, to our increasingly social habits, rather than to the prescription of our laws. Repeal tomorrow every law dealing with the protection of the person, and tomorrow stop all proceedings for assault, and the number of attempts dictated by personal vengeance and by brutality would not be augmented by one single instance. It will perhaps be objected that during the last 50 years, a good many liberal laws have been enacted. But if these laws are analyzed, it will be discovered that this liberal legislation consists in the repeal of the laws bequeathed to us by the barbarism of preceding centuries. Every liberal law, every radical program may be summed up in these words: abolition of laws grown irksome to the middle class itself, and return and extension to all citizens of liberties enjoyed by the townships of the 12th century. The abolition of capital punishment, trial by jury for all crimes — there was a more liberal jury in the 12th century — the election of magistrates, the right of bringing public officials to trial, the abolition of standing armies, free instruction, etc. Everything that is pointed out as an invention of modern liberalism is but a return to the freedom which existed before church and king had laid hands upon every manifestation of human life. Thus, the protection of exploitation directly by laws on property and indirectly by the maintenance of the state is both the spirit and the substance of our modern codes, and the one function of our costly legislative machinery. But it is time we give up being satisfied with mere phrases and learn to appreciate their real significance. The law, which on its first appearance presented itself as a compendium of customs useful for the preservation of society, is now perceived to be nothing but an instrument for the maintenance of exploitation and the domination of the toiling masses by rich idlers. At the present day, its civilizing mission is nil. It has but one object: to bolster up exploitation. This is what is told to us by the history as to the development of the law. Is it in virtue of this history that we are called to respect it? Certainly not. It has no more title to respect than capital, the fruit of pillage, and the first duty of the revolution will be to make a bonfire of all the existing laws, as it will of all titles to property. That was part 3. We're going to move into part 4 pretty soon. Again, this is Pyotr Kropotkin, Anarchism. We're reading the essay Law and Authority. Let's go. The millions of laws which exist for the regulation of humanity appear upon investigation to be divided into 3 principal categories: protection of property, the protection of persons, and protection of the government. And by analyzing each of these 3 categories, we arrive at the same logical and necessary conclusion: the uselessness and hurtfulness of law. Socialists know what is meant by protection of property. Laws on property are not made to guarantee either to the individual or to society the enjoyment of the produce of their own labor. On the contrary, they are made to rob the producer of a part of what he has created, and to secure to certain other people that portion of the produce which they have stolen either from the producer or from society as a whole. When, for example, the law establishes Mr. So-and-so's right to build a house, it is not establishing his right to a cottage he has built for himself, or to a house he has erected with the help of some of his friends. In that case, no one would have disputed his right. On the contrary, the law is establishing his right to a house which is not the product of his labor. First of all, because he had it built for him by others, to whom he has not paid the full value of their work. And next, because that house represents a social value which he could not have produced for himself. The law is establishing his right what belongs to everybody in general and to nobody in particular. The same house built in the midst of Siberia would not have the value it possesses in a large town, and as we know, that value arises from the labor of something like 50 generations of men who have built the town, beautified it, supplied it with water and gas, fine promenades, colleges, theaters, shops, railways, and roads leading in all directions. Thus, by recognizing the right of Mr. So-and-so to a particular house in Paris, London, or Rouen, the law is unjustly appropriating to him a certain portion of the produce of labor of mankind in general. And it is precisely because this appropriation and all other forms of property bearing the same character are a crying injustice, that a whole arsenal of laws and a whole army of soldiers, policemen, and judges are needed to maintain against the good sense and just feeling inherent in humanity. Half our laws, the civil code in each country, serves no purpose than to maintain this appropriation, this monopoly for the benefit of certain individuals against the whole of mankind. 3/4 of the causes decided by the tribunals are nothing but quarrels between monopolists, 2 robbers discussing their booty, and a great many of our criminal laws have the same object in view, their end being the workman in a subordinate position towards his employer, and thus afford security for exploitation. As for guaranteeing the product of his labor to the producer, there are no laws which even attempt such a thing. It is so simple and natural, so much a part of manners and customs of mankind, that law has not given it so much as a thought. Open brigandage, sword in hand, is no feature of our age. Neither does one workman ever come and dispute the produce of his labor with another. If they have a misunderstanding, they settle it by calling in a third person, without having recourse to the law. The only person who exacts from another what the other has produced is the proprietor, who comes in and deducts the lion's share. As for humanity in general, it everywhere respects the right of each to what he has created, without the interposition of any special laws. As all the laws about property make up the thick volumes of code, and are the delight of our lawyers, have no other object than protect the unjust appropriation of human labor by certain monopolists, there is no reason for their existence, and on the day of the revolution, social revolutionists are thoroughly determined to put end to them. Indeed, a bonfire might be made with perfect justice of all the laws bearing upon the so-called right to property, as title deeds, all registers, in a word, of all that is in any way connected with an institution which will soon be looked upon as the blot in the history of humanity, as humiliating as slavery and serfdom of the past ages. The remarks just made upon laws concerning property are quite as applicable to the second category of law, those for the maintenance of government, i.e., constitutional law. It is again a complete arsenal of laws, decrees, ordinances, orders in council, and whatnot, all serving to protect the diverse forms of representative government, delegated or usurped, beneath which humanity is writhing. We know very well, anarchists have often pointed out in their perpetual criticism of the various forms of government, that the mission of all governments, monarchical, constitutional, or republican, is to protect and maintain by force the privileges of the classes in possession, the aristocracy, clergy, and traders. A good third of our laws, and each country possesses some tens of thousands of them, the fundamental laws on taxes, excise duties, the organization of ministerial departments in their offices, of the army, the police, the church, etc., have no other end than to maintain, patch up, and develop the administrative machine. And this machine, in its turn, serves almost entirely to protect the privileges of the possessing class. Analyze all these laws, observe them in action day by day, and you will discover that not one is worth preserving. About such laws there can be no two opinions. Not only anarchists, but more or less revolutionary radicals also, are agreed that the only use to be made of laws concerning the organization of the government is to fling them into the fire. The third category of law still remains to be considered, that relating to the protection of the person and the detection and prevention of crime. This is the most important because most prejudices attach to it, because if law enjoys a certain amount of consideration, it is in consequence to the belief that this species of law is absolutely indispensable to the maintenance of security in our societies. These are laws developed from the nucleus of customs useful to human communities, which have been turned to account by rulers to sanctify their own domination. The authority of the chiefs of tribes, of rich families and towns, and of the king depended upon their judicial functions, and even down to the present day, whether the necessity of government is spoken of, its function as supreme judge is the thing implied. Without a government, men would tear each other to pieces, argues the village orator. The ultimate end of all government is to secure 12 honest jurymen to every accused person, says Berg. Well, in spite of all the prejudices existing on this subject, it is quite time that anarchists should boldly declare this category of laws as useless and as injurious as the preceding ones. First of all, as to so-called crimes, assault upon persons, it is well known that 2/3, and often as many as 3/4 of such crimes are instigated by the desire to obtain possession of someone's wealth. This immense class of so-called crimes and misdemeanors will disappear on the day which private property ceases to exist. But, it will be said, there will always be brutes who will attempt the lives of their fellow citizens, who will lay their hands to a knife in every quarrel, and revenge the slightest offense by murder, if there are no laws to restrain punishments to withhold them. This refrain is repeated every time the right of society to punish is called in question. Yet there is one fact concerning the head which at the present time is thoroughly dismissed. The severity of the punishment does not diminish the amount of crime. Hang, and if you like, quarter murderers, and the amount of murderers will not decrease by one. On the other, abolish the penalty of death, and there will be not one murder more. There will be fewer. Statistics prove it. But if the harvest is good and bread cheap and the weather fine, the number of murders immediately decreases. This is again proved by statistics. The amount of crime always augments and diminishes in proportion to the price of provisions and the state of the weather. Not that all murderers are actuated by hunger. That is not the case. But when the harvest is good and provisions are at an obtainable price, and when the sun shines, men, lighter-hearted and less miserable than usual, do not give way to gloomy passions, and do not from trivial motives plunge a knife into the bosom of a fellow creature. Moreover, it is also a well-known fact that the fear of punishment has never stopped a signal murderer. He who kills his neighbor from revenge or misery does not reason much about consequences, and there have been few murderers who were not firmly convinced that they should escape prosecution. Without speaking of a society in which man will receive a better education, in which the development of all his faculties, and the possibility of exercising them, will procure him so many enjoyments that he will not seek to poison them by remorse. Even in our society, even with those sad products of misery whom we see today in the public houses of great cities, on the day when no punishment is inflicted upon murders, the number of murders will not be augmented by a single case, and it is extremely probable that it will be, on the contrary, diminished by all the cases which are due at present to habitual criminals who have been brutalized in prisons. We are continually told of the benefits conferred by law and the beneficial effect of penalties, but have the speakers ever attempted to strike a balance between the benefits attributed to laws and penalty and the degrading effects of these penalties upon humanity? Only calculate all the evil passions awakened in mankind by the atrocious punishment formerly inflicted in our streets. Man is the cruelest animal upon earth, and who has pampered and developed the cruel instincts unknown, even among monkeys, if it is not the king, the judge, and the priests, armed with the law? Who caused flesh to be torn off in strips, boiling pitch to be poured into wounds, limbs to be dislocated, bones to be crushed, men to be sawn asunder to maintain their authority? Only estimate the torrent of depravity let loose in human society by the informing, which is countenanced by judges, and paid in hard cash by governments, under the pretext of assisting in the discovery of crime. Only go into the jails and study what man becomes when he is deprived of freedom and shut up with other depraved beings, steeped in the vice and corruption which oozes from the very walls of our existing prisons. Only remember that the more these prisons are reformed, the more detestable they become. Our model modern penitentiaries are 100-fold more abominable than the dungeons of the Middle Ages. Finally, consider what corruption, what depravity of mind is kept up among men by the idea of obedience, the very essence of law, of chastisement, of authority having the right to punish, to judge irrespective of our conscience and the esteem of our friends, and the necessity for executioners, jailers, and informers, in a word, by all the attributes of law and authority. Consider all this, and you will assuredly agree with us in saying that a law inflicting penalties is an abomination which should cease to exist. Peoples without political organization, and therefore less depraved than ourselves, have perfectly understood that the man who is called a criminal is simply unfortunate, that the remedy is not to flog him, to chain him up, or to kill him on the scaffold or in prison, but to help him by most brotherly care, by treatment based on equality, by the usages of life among honest men. In the next revolution, we hope that this cry will go forth. Burn the guillotines, demolish the prisons, drive away the judges, policemen, and informers, the impurest race upon the face of the earth. Treat as a brother the man who have been led by passion to do ill but to his fellow. Above all, take from the ignoble products of the middle-class idleness the possibility of displaying their vices in attractive colors, and be sure that but few crimes will mar our society. The main supporters of crime are idleness, law, and authority. Laws about property, laws about government, laws about penalties and misdemeanors, and authority, which takes upon itself to manufacture these laws and to apply them. No more laws, no more judges. Liberty, equality, and practical human sympathy are the only effectual barriers we can oppose to the antisocial instincts of certain among us. All right, that was Law and Authority, Pyotr Kropotkin. That was fun. Now, I guess it's time to like transition into Q&A, because I'm not really done here. Yeah, you're welcome, guys. That was a really fun one. I really like Peter's like analysis of Law and Authority, and I think it pairs really well with sort of the modern situation that we're currently in, especially when he talks about like, oh, we have seen that like crime is an outgrowth of material conditions, and like we understand that if you increase the harshness of the punishment, you actually increase the likelihood of crime. If you decrease the harshness of punishment, you actually decrease the likelihood of crime. Have you seen what Norwegian prisons are like? I have. Yeah, certainly interesting. They're definitely still prisons, so there's still some work to go, but definitely interesting. Oh my god, voice hurts. I don't know if you guys can hear, but there's like a lot of graduation stuff going on outside, so there's like some cheering going on. But yeah. Have you read the Green Book that addresses how to structure an accountable society? I have not. I will add that to my reading list. That sounds really interesting. Green Book. It shows in early contact Maori, before prisons and police, we were said to have very low crime. Exactly, yeah. Most like pre-law societies, pre-civilization societies had very low crime, obviously, because, you know, and one thing I really like about anarchist like evaluation of the world, anarchist analysis, is that it usually takes its basis in anthropology and evolutionary, like it draws upon evolution as a justification for like all of its understanding, and I think that's a really good basis for like any political system, because obviously like evolutionary morality is real, you know, like it's hard to explain why, you know, morality should have come from religion when religion is obviously not as old as humanity, versus like when we take a basis in evolution, then we can understand that like this is something that not only happens in humanity but also happens in like other animal species as well, and it understands why other animals are able to regulate themselves well, and humans before like colonization, before like, you know, all of these like people who came in and civilized us, like, you know, they like basically came in and ruined everything. Not just animals but ecosystems. Yes, exactly. Like entire communities of often conflicting forces are able to engage in they're able to like engage in self-regulation, not because they're like adhering to any sort of scripture or whatever, but just because like evolution installs within us like the means of self-replication and self-preservation, and those just happen to be anarchist. Like it's not a mistake that like, you know, we see anarchism as like constantly referencing evolution, because evolution and the evolutionary path by which we have come about is anarchist. So yeah, pretty freaking cool, right? Oh my god, I love your content. Thank you so much. That means a lot. we're slowly bringing it back. We call it Maori justice. It's used for small crimes. Are you talking about Maori? In Maori society? Yeah, that's really cool. Anarchy requires regulations, so it's stupid. You know, you can think that. Anarchism, communism, handshake. Yeah, exactly. You know, you tend to understand that, like, these things come hand in hand. Like, you obviously can't have anarchism without communism, but as well, you can't have communism without anarchism. Because, like, as Kropotkin said within the book, like, these laws, these governments exist to perpetuate capital and exploitation. And then the other half of, like, why governments exist is to perpetuate themselves. So it's like they exist to perpetuate capital, and then these laws come about to perpetuate the laws that perpetuate capital, which I think is like really visible in modern society, like especially when you look at like how we govern around things like monopolies, right? Like we allow things like Amazon or things like, you know, Boeing to get massively inflated, and then the laws that we come in and regulate them with is not for the benefit of like the consumer. It's not for us. It's not so that like, oh, the environment is protected or whatever. It's literally so these companies like Amazon and like Boeing can continue without self-imploding. And then when we have like laws that say, oh, okay, so we can't like have anarchy, or like we can't have like capitalism that is unrestricted, otherwise capitalism will implode upon itself, and we like capitalism, so they create governments to regulate capitalism that literally just continue capitalism. So it's like, you know how people say that FDR was the savior of capitalism? That's what I'm talking about here. Like, he went and he engaged in the New Deal, not because he was like, oh, like, I really like people having enough food to eat, and I like a federal jobs guarantee. That's not really what he was, like, for. He was doing it because if he didn't do that, there was, like, a ton of socialist agitation, a ton of Marxists within America. If he had not made it, like, way more easy, like, if he had not made the country more livable, it would have never survived in like past a year, which is why I think America is sort of at a crossroads right now, almost literally 100 years later, where we're seeing a similar sort of setup of massive wealth inequality, of these companies monopolizing egregiously, and either we're going to have a sort of New Deal imposed upon us, which like makes it more livable to live in America, but its ultimate goal is still to like stop any revolutionary action, or it's going to keep progressing and we're going to have either a socialist or a fascist revolution. One of the two is most definitely about to happen. We would have had a socialist revolution if FDR didn't implement changes. I really believe that. I do believe that. Especially when you look at, like, all the agitation that was happening around workers and strikes at that period. And, like, Emma Goldman was literally in America at that time, like, agitating for anarchism and for, like, anarchist causes. And they were super, super popular. So, I think it's not surprising that the New Deal got passed when it did. What I think would be surprising is if a New Deal type of law got passed today. I don't think that would happen. And one reason why, okay, I'm going to bring up another book, but I'm not going to read it, but I'm just going to bring it out. You look at Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein. Excellent freaking book. This explains the growth of neoliberalism through the country, through the world. And essentially, I think what's happened is that we sent so many neoliberal capitalists, like neoliberal economists, out into the world, into places like Latin America, into, you know, Africa, and they have all, like, ruins their countries, and that we've seen like a huge level of monopolization, a huge level of openness to foreign exploitation, a huge level of wealth inequality. And now those same economists have come home, and they've essentially become Republican politicians. And obviously the Democrats are, impotent as always. Not as always, but they're impotent. And so we're seeing this strange happenstance where the actually more conservative force are the Democrats versus the strict neoliberals in the Republican Party, who are genuinely trying to enact like a full neoliberal revolution within the United States, which has never really happened before. Like, yes, Ronald Reagan did neoliberalism, but Reagan and Thatcher never actually pursued neoliberalism to the extent that, like, people that, like, the people they put into place in, like, Latin America, like, pursued neoliberalism. So now you have all these Republicans who are, like, actually instituting, like, oh, we're gonna, like, be hardline on the budget, and we're not gonna let you, like, pass a budget bill so we can increase budgetary spending. If that happens, America literally defaults on their bills, and, like, global capitalism goes into, like, crisis mode. Like, I don't think I don't know if they understand, like, exactly what they're playing with. Like, they're sort of playing with the entire, like, market force of the world. And, like, if America defaults on their bills like the Republicans are trying to drive them to do, it is, like, disastrous for the capitalist system. But they are so plugged into, I guess, neoliberalism and neoliberal, like, economics that, like, they're actually pursuing something like a budget halt, which does not help literally anyone. Like, that's not helpful. But, so it would be interesting to me if we got a New Deal type of situation in America, because it seems to me like the Republican Party is actually trying to drive us into, like, what we saw in the 70s and 80s in Latin America and Africa, where you actually had, like, full-scale economic collapse. And, naturally, the Democrats are really not doing shit about it. That's just kind of what they do. Would it be unemployment that triggers it? That's an interesting one. I'm gonna say no, just because, like I said in my last TikTok that I saw Angela Davis speak, and what she said is that the prison industrial complex is essentially like an outgrowth of the unemployment, like, crisis, where you have a society that is not actually doing much work, does not actually have as many jobs as it has people. So, we sort of expanded and hyper inflated the, like, prison industrial complex in order to control the unemployment crisis. So I think if there was a period of, like, chronic unemployment, you would just see an increase in, like, policing and, like, an increase in unjust imprisonment, an increase in, like, laws around where you can go, what you can do, all that sort of stuff, which is, disheartening. What was the book being read earlier? It was Anarchism by Pyotr Kropotkin, and the specific essay was Law and Authority. Oh my god. We're going to have a severe food system collapse in the very near future. That'll trigger something. Most certainly it will. I think back in, like, the 1800s, one of the biggest, like, workers' rights things was actually, like, the grain party or something. So farmers are definitely, like, an area of significant revolutionary potential, I'll say. However, our food system is, again, like, dependent on a lot of global extraction, and also upon the unpaid labor of a lot of different groups, specifically undocumented immigrants. So I think it's it's difficult to organize specifically around food production because the state cracks down so hard on food production workers, especially if they're undocumented, that it would be, I guess, difficult to organize in a way that, you know, the people who actually like are partaking in the food production system are the ones who are on like the leading charge of that. Because typically in revolutions, you don't actually see like the front runners of said revolutions being the most affected, which is a kind of weird happenstance. So it's just gonna get worse and worse. It sounds like the New Deal situation. Yeah, I don't believe a New Deal type thing is gonna happen within the United States. Oh Lord. As an agriculture major, they're heavily centralized and would start cracking after society starts falling. Yeah, definitely. How do you prevent the resurgence of capitalism after revolution without a monopoly on violence, the state? You know, I'm not like a hardline anarchist, and this is also feeds into, do you have any critiques on modern day anarchists? Yeah, I'm not like a hardline anarchist. Specifically, the reason that I call myself an anarchist is not because I don't believe that like a dictatorship of the proletariat is like unhelpful, but rather because I think there needs to be a group of people who like are a check to the unrestrained power of the state. So it's like, if we're going to have workers be in control of the state for a period of time, you also need to have workers like monitoring the state and making sure that the state is not just like doing whatever to preserve its own power. Because again, Kropotkin doesn't just critique law like that is based on the preservation of private property. He also critiques law that is meant to preserve the state, and he says that the state is perpetuated based on preserving the power of protected classes. And if we're going to have a state that is like a worker state, we have to make sure that it is like aimed at the protection of humanity and not just ultimately the creation and protection of the creation of a new class of people that are birthed out of the previous workers' movement, which is what we literally saw in the fall of the USSR, which is the same protected class became like the same protected class of state leaders within the USSR immediately were the ones who became oligarchs within the capitalist system. That is a system that needed severe checks on authority and on the distribution of power. And just because like it had workers slapped in front of it does not mean that like it was incapable of doing harm to workers or being undemocratic. Yeah. Oh my god, there's a lot of you. Do you have any critiques on libertarian socialists? Yeah, they should just call themselves anarchists. What theory do you recommend to people wanting to learn more about anarchism? Angela Davis is a wonderful, wonderful source. Emma Goldman's Anarchism, what does it stand for? Great source. Peter Kropotkin is obviously my favorite, and his book, The Conquest of Bread, is like necessary for like any sort of anarchist understanding. I guess there's also, yeah, that's mostly it. Why are there screams going on in the background? There's a lot of graduation parties happening right now. I don't really know. Yeah. Oh, thank you. It's like an ML video I watched which said we need anarchists to keep us in check. Yeah, I agree. Like, I don't think I'm not, like, obviously if an anarchist revolution happened, I'd be, like, very happy. But if, like, who's, like, oh, we need to have, like, I'm not against, like, the dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm not one for leftist infighting, I think you'll find. Which I've gotten, like, a lot of, like, comments that are like, oh, you're, like, the chillest anarchist, or, like, you're the anarchist that, like, makes the most sense to me. It's, like, it's not really because I'm, like, you know, I'm all that different from, like, other anarchists. It's just that, like, I openly call myself an anarchist, and I still have respect for like other socialist factions. That's like, it's not that I'm just like a different type of anarchist, or like the anarchist with the most sense. It's just that, like, you know, I'm an anarchist, and I believe that like other socialists have done incredible things. It's, you know, it's not all that different. Anyway, I have nothing to add, but just wanted to say that I love your TikToks and your takes. Keep it up. Oh, thank you. Anarchists are friends to the workers' movement. We agree to get rid of the state. Absolutely. It's like, you know, the state obviously needs checks. It can be used in useful ways, but it is not supposed to be something that will last forever. It is also not going to be the solution to all of our problems, you know? Like, you can't expect to weaponize the state whenever anyone does anything, because then you will never actually reach communism, which is sort of a weird sort of like thing. Are you a classical anarchist like Kropotkin, Bakunin, Emma Goldman? Sort of. I definitely love their theory, and I base my worldview on their theory, but I also like take influence from like Lenin. I recently had like a 2-hour discussion with someone arguing that his thesis of imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism is like absolutely correct. And then, like, I call myself an eco-anarchist, a green anarchist, specifically because a lot of my analysis of, like, the fundamental flaws of capitalism sort of come back to the fact that it's dependent on infinite growth on a finite planet, which is fundamentally impossible. What the hell? Which is fundamentally, like, impossible, and also, like, super disrespectful of the climate and like the environment. So yeah, I think a lot of my like theoretical basis does come back to classic anarchism. However, it's also inspired by a lot of Marxist-Leninists, and also by like anti-colonial like people as well. Like Frantz Fanon is like a gift to the planet. Like his analysis is just like beautiful. Do you think you'll see the fall of capitalism and the rise of socialism in your lifetime? If not, when? I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I think it's very possible, especially because the United States is at such a crossroads, and the United States has historically been a bastion for the protection of the free market. So I think if the United States were to, I guess, lose its sort of stability, which is happening very rapidly, you would immediately see an international reaction that would, like, tip the scales in favor of an international revolution towards socialism, right? Because, like, think of all the different countries that are currently, like, socialist in name, but are not able to do much socializing because of the United States and their oppressive regime. Cuba immediately comes to mind, like China immediately comes to mind, like all of these countries, Vietnam immediately comes to mind, like all of these countries are like, you don't think the world would slide into fascism? I do think there would be a fascist slide. However, where there is a rise in fascism in some parts of the country, there is also usually a concurrent rise in socialism in other parts of the country. So, like, we're seeing it in the United States right now. Like, as the right is becoming more and more fascistic, the left is becoming more and more revolutionary, at least the base of the left, right? Like, obviously the Democrats are not becoming like more socialist, but you're having more and more people who are saying like capitalism is not working, and that is the normative stance, right? Like you always see in periods where capitalism is failing a rise in fascistic behavior. That is not at all new, right? But because capitalism is failing, you will see people who analyze it correctly and say, oh, we need to destroy the capitalist system. And you will see people who analyze it incorrectly and scapegoat minorities and do all these different things. And you will see a rise in fascistic behavior. That is not new whatsoever. That has been the trend forever. Fascism always rise in concurrently with socialism. And it is why fascists consistently position themselves as the saviors of capitalism against the perpetrators against capitalism, which are the socialists, right? Whenever there is like increased socialist movements, like the movements literally interact and reinforce each other at times. Like, obviously socialism is the number one thing that can counteract fascism, but fascists as well always position themselves or always get their start when the ruling class sees that people are moving towards socialism and starts funneling money, resources, attention away from the fall of capitalism into scapegoating random minorities. So, like, it's not surprising that, like, there is a world increase in fascism. It is actually to be expected. And more so, it is, actually indicative of the fact that capitalism is at a period of instability that it maybe hasn't been at for a while. BRICS is going to win the world over the West. I actually do believe that. The Belt and Road Initiative, I do believe that, like, that China will win a lot of allies through the Belt and Road Initiative. And hey, I don't, good for them. If we, USA, go to World War III, do you think conditions here would get so bad there'd be a revolution? I think it's interesting. War has an interesting impact on people in that it either makes them more revolutionary or less revolutionary. War can be used easily to engender nationalistic spirits within people. Like World War II specifically was very good at making people identify with the spirit of the nation. And you also saw, like, for example, Margaret Thatcher used the war against the Falkland Islands to increase her popularity, specifically because her neoliberal, like, agenda was failing so badly that people didn't want her to see a second term. And that war actually helped her get reelected. So war can, in some cases, like, make people identify more with the states and more with nationalism and patriotism or whatever. However, war can also have the opposite impact of making people more hostile to the states. Specifically, you can look at examples like, the Russia-Ukraine war, how Russians are sort of like revolting against their government right now. Or you can look at examples like the Vietnam War, where you had a ton of anti-war protests, which actually led to a whole bunch of social activism against, like, the military-industrial complex. Markets seem like the most effective way of organizing the economy / a multitude of different specific ones, in my opinion. No. Not enough, like, room to explain this, but even, like, the original, like, creator of the idea that markets could be, like, the organization of society, Adam Smith, he was not like, oh, markets should, like, take over the entire world. But the principal thing that Adam Smith misses is he believes that there is a single thing that everyone is competing, there's a single thing that everyone has, which is called a competitive advantage. And you're able to sell that competitive advantage to everyone else. Crucially, Adam Smith was writing at a period in time in which markets were only just emerging. He was not writing in the context of, like, the global market system that we're seeing right now. And so if we were to try to apply some of his theory, like Adam Smith's theory right now, literally, like, the competitive advantage of Africa would literally just be resources and cheap labor. So, like, when we see, and, like, Africa is obviously not doing very well in the context of its competitive advantage literally being how exploitable it is. So it's like, if we are to actually argue that, like, markets are the best way to organize society, you have to then admit that, oh, some people are just gonna get exploited, and that's tough. You're gonna have child labor, because, like, the competitive advantage of children over adults is obvious in a market system because they're way more easily exploited. The market will at every point, like, choose child labor over, like, adult labor, and you're seeing it right now. Do you think pre-contact indigenous societies get left out of discussions too much when talking about capitalism? Yes, definitely. I think anthropology is a difficult like subject, because it got its start in a lot of racism and trying to perpetuate like the existing world class systems. But then again, anthropology can also help us to understand more about pre-colonial societies. It's very important. And I think there needs to be sort of a reimagining of the anthropological department as a whole, like the anthropological sciences as a whole, because the way that they're currently organized is not good. Speaking of the failure of neoliberalism, do you think that's why Biden is pushing for war so heavy? Yes. Yes, immediately, yes. Specifically, war with China, because when you see like what the United States is doing with China, it is absolutely ridiculous. Like like blowing up their balloon, like the weather balloon, Nancy Pelosi taking a trip to Taiwan, like all of these things are obvious agitations of the United States with China. And then when you see, like, obviously why we're doing that is because, you know, America gains popularity among the American government gets the consent of its like workers through wars, right? We've been in perpetual war since like the 70s, and we are now in a period where we're not in official conflict with anyone, which is a very interesting position to be in. And again, I think it comes back to the fact that America is sort of trying to hide its unemployment crisis. One way that it attempts to hide the unemployment crisis is prisons. The other way it attempts to hide the unemployment crisis is by deployment, military deployment. So you literally like send huge portions of the population out to other countries to war, because there's literally like no jobs here. Like there's no meaningful production to be done here in America, because we've outsourced all of our production to like third world countries. And that's what the market does, right? Like that's what the competitive advantage has done. By the way, I'm engaging in good faith, but modern econ is past Adam Smith, I thought. It is. However, again, shock doctrine, Naomi Klein. I think the modern economy is really based right now in neoliberalism. Neoliberalism takes a whole bunch of Adam Smith's like original thoughts around the market and dials them up to like an insane degree. So I think the modern economy definitely isn't what Adam Smith was envisioning. It's a lot less humane than what Adam Smith was envisioning, frankly. But a lot of the same concepts from Adam Smith can be applied. You have some topic recs to research about anarchism in non-Western / non-white societies. I actually read a book, African Anarchism, I believe it was. That was a really good one. It was by this guy named Sam Mba, I think. Yeah, so like his book was really good, and then there's others, but they're just not coming to me right now, I'm gonna be real. Why is it light out there? It's like 8 p.m. I'm in California, so I wonder how that would play out, though. America is dependent on China production. Yeah, an America-China war would be very interesting, because you'll remember back in like 2018, 2019, we had a trade war with China, and because of like Donald Trump, that did not go successful like at all, because obviously so much of American production has shifted to China, has shifted to nations that are supported by like the Chinese economy. And so attempting to like engage in conflict with China at the same time as we get so much of our production from China would be stupid. But again, like neoliberalism is fundamentally stupid. Like this is not a surprise. And there's obviously like precedent for engaging in conflict from a region that you're also actively exploiting. Conflict within like the Middle East is ultimately at the service of like oil extraction, and we still extracted oil. So, um oh my god, there's a lot of y'all. Do you think the general public will be willing to take on a different response or feeling towards the mention of socialism or communism? I think we're definitely beginning to see it, obviously. Within younger people, capitalism is already like mostly hated. So it's like it doesn't take much, honestly. I think the left needs to get way better at messaging. But like after we do that, I think we'll be pretty golden. And also, I think it's hard because we have to counter fascist messaging, which is specifically designed to shift your attention away from the impacts of capitalism. But once we do that, like, I think, dumb, but doesn't war with China equal World War III? Yes. Which is why I think we're sort of seeing an emerging multipolarity within the world order. Especially in the context, like when you see how like the African Union, for example, members of the African Union have declined to what's the word for it? It's like they've declined to say that like the Russia-Ukraine war, or like they've declined to like sign on to a U.S. declaration or UN declaration that like the Russia-Ukraine war is like horrible or whatever. Like you're starting to see a bunch of countries moving away from U.S. hegemony, which is why like a U.S.-China war at this specific moment in time, especially with all of the outreach that China is doing, like China has literally united like Saudi Arabia and I think Iran. So it's like with all of the like allies that China is garnering through their Belt and Road Initiative, through their like loans, through their like medical assistance, through their aid, like I think you could literally see a new World War II or World War III, and one that is specifically like ideologically based. I think it'd be like it'd sort of be the sequel to both World War II and the Cold War, in that it would be a war including the entire world, in which the world order literally shifts. And also it is an ideological war of like literally, are we going capitalism or socialism? And I think capitalism might not have as many allies this time. Thoughts on David Graeber? Picked up his latest book, The Dawn of Everything. He's awesome. I listened to one of his lectures on debt. He has just like a fantastic way of like analyzing the world. I love his book Bullshit Jobs. I referenced it in my latest TikTok. It's really cool. There's been a huge shift in the way the public views socialism and communism. Yes. Obviously, yeah, because we're at a point where capitalism is very publicly failing, especially failing like the working class and the middle class. So you're going to have a rise in socialist tendencies, but you're also going to have a rise in fascist tendencies, and we need to be way better at countering that, because the people who are sticking by capitalism are sticking by capitalism because they're also supplementing their capitalism with like fascism. Even right-wingers hate capitalism now. They just call it the matrix or the elites. Exactly. They're doing scapegoat stuff. They're doing typical fascist like rhetoric. It's not surprising. It is dangerous. It is very dangerous. It is not surprising. We're also living with generations that didn't grow up in the Cold War with that messaging. That's true, yes. So I'm an ML and I love your stuff. Curious why you don't want a Vanguard party. I touched on this a bit earlier in the live, but I am not the kind of anarchist who's like 100% against the dictatorship of the proletariat. I would actually be like fine with the dictatorship of the proletariat. The reason I call myself an anarchist is I believe that if there were to be something like a workers' party, it would need checks to make sure that like authority does not replicate itself in a destructive manner. So I think that anarchists, one way that is really useful for our existence is not necessarily to be against any sort of Marxist organizing or Leninist organizing, but to provide checks against like unrestrained power of like the government in the wake of any sort of like socialist or state socialist like organizing. Hold on. Okay. Samaya, how did you become so slay? Is your family's politics close to yours? My family's politics is absolutely not close to mine. My parents are Nigerian immigrants. Let me not even do this, but I'm very different from my parents, certainly. As for how I became so slay, I got radicalized after Bernie Sanders dropped out of the primaries. I was always sort of like on the more radical liberal, I guess, side. And then I was always for wealth redistribution, but I didn't have the language for it until I read theory. And that's why I think that like reading theory is so important. That's why I do these live streams where I like read theory to you guys, because like I do think having the language around some of these ideas is like really important, and that really happens when you read what like past like theorists have actually said. The future and AI is just marketing, right? I think we are already the automatons. What do you think? That's an interesting thing to say. I think there could actually be some like application of automation in, the future, whatever, especially if we're going to be building a socialist society, because again, like the goal of socialism and of leftist like agitation in general is that we want to be doing less work, right? Like, and so automation, I think, is really helpful for eliminating some of the undesirable or like under desired positions in society. So like I think technology can be really helpful in like making sure nobody we don't have like a plumber in this area, like, but we have like a bot that is able to do plumbing within this area. I think that's really cool. Ayn Rand turned me into learning about communism because of how questionable her philosophy is. You know what? That is actually genius. Like, I love that. I was radicalized by being poor in America. That's real, Being poor in America, being black in America, that'll get you there. What book do you recommend for a beginner regarding theory? Principles of Communism, Frederick Engels. There's a bunch of like pamphlets out there that are more modern, but that basically like explain the modern relation between workers and capitalists. Like, there's this one, Abolish Restaurants, that I got from this anarchist bookstore, and it is so perfect in explaining that like we're not looking to like reform the dynamic between the worker and the capitalist. We're actually looking to like dissolve it entirely. Automation would only be good as a post-capitalist society, but automation under capitalism is bad. Exactly. Yeah, so under capitalism, automation represents a threat to workers, because the capitalist does not want you to work less. That's like a key feature of capitalism, is that you're constantly working more, you're becoming more and more productive. Like, the statistics prove this, but we're not working less at all, right? Like, we are producing so much more, and yet we still have the same 8-hour workday, when statistics literally prove that there's no reason for us to be working any longer than like 4 hours a day. And I think, again, I'm coming back to what Angela Davis said, because it just like struck a match in me. I think, again, you're also seeing this because literally the capitalist does not want you to be away from either work, prison, or military experience. Like, those are the things that like every member of society needs to be engaged in, unless you are like extremely young or like very old. And so that is why, like, you have, like, the capitalist, literally, the system does not want you to engage in leisure time, which is why you have continually intruding upon your hours of what is supposed to be, like, your hours of leisure. Like, you know, like, you're supposed to be in the office 8 hours a day, and then you're also supposed to be on call for whenever your boss virtually needs to reach you. You know, you're being consistently surveilled so that at the slightest infraction, you can be sent to whatever prison. Like, I think it's actually a cover-up for the fact that we have a huge portion of the population that is literally not necessary. Like, we do not need them to work at all. And, like, we can sustain them very easily. However, if you have that chronic unemployment under capitalism, the people will just revolt. So America, as like the most capitalist nation on the planet, or one of the most capitalist nations anyway, in order to like preserve its system, it literally has to either convince your, like, it has to force your boss to like make you stay in the office and make you commit increasing amounts of like your life to work. It has to arrest you, or it has to send you abroad into the military. Because if you're not in prison doing military subjugation or in work, you will revolt. So I think that's literally America's like way of, in the post-70s, post-80s era, quelling a revolution that really should have happened. Like, when you look at the 70s or 80s, like, there was a lot of revolutionary agitation, and the way that it was quelled is either you got sent to work, you got sent to prison, or you got sent to the draft. That's how it worked. Productivity is high, but wages are stagnant. That means more labor value is being stolen. Exactly. We're producing more and literally getting less. It's like we're actually being robbed. Back when I worked in fast food, I got paid $10 a freaking hour. Like, literally every 5 minutes, we would complete an order that was like $10 or more. So it's like I was making like 30 orders or so every single hour, and I could only afford one of them. That's ridiculous, right? Like, in that kind of system, you're literally being robbed. It's like, I am producing this stuff, and I cannot even afford any of it. Like when you realize in that system, that's like, oh, like, I'm actually being robbed. And one of the things, that one quote is that, like, good workers get punished with more work. I literally experienced that 100%. It's like, I was one of the like most efficient workers within that freaking fast food place, and I literally got, like, they called me in and they're like, yeah, you're doing good, but we need you to do more. I was not getting a pay increase. I was not, like, there was no benefits that I was receiving. I was a high schooler, and they were saying, like, yeah, you need to put in more effort. And that's ridiculous. It's like the better you are at working, the more they will work you. And it's related to what Karl Marx is like, Marx's alienation, I think alienation from the process of production, which is literally, he's saying that, like, yeah, if you are like good at your job, you will be exploited more and more. So it's like, as a worker, the best thing you can do for yourself is be bad at your job. Is literally be the worst worker in the eyes of like the capitalists, because if you are a good worker, they are stealing more from you. They're literally stealing more from you. That's like, it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating, and you don't realize until you're actually in the system, and until you have the language for describing what's actually happening to you. Like, back in high school, I did not have the language to say that, like, this does not seem right. Like, I'm literally one of the most efficient people here, and yet I feel like I am taken advantage of to a degree that, like, the others are not. And it's because I literally are. I'm like, in the process of making things, I am selling myself. It is ridiculous. Are you in a college program studying? Yes. I'm in college. I'm studying political science. I have a minor in peace and justice studies, possible minor next semester in philosophy as well. Yeah. Here in New Zealand, despite the minimum wage being $24 an hour, disabled workers can legally be paid $3 an hour. Yeah. It's, I think, the same in the United States, except it's a lot worse. Disabled people, I think, can be paid like pennies per hour. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the system is also set up so that when disabled people have too much money, like when disabled people are making a livable wage, all of their benefits get cut off. So like disabled people literally have to make like below a certain income, otherwise they will not get their own benefits, which they literally need in order to like be a productive member of society. It's so ridiculous. It's so annoying. I hate it so much. Anyway, thoughts on leftists that turned right-wing neoliberals. Sold out, but also oftentimes what you'll see is that leftists get they get turned by scapegoating, like this, the same way that fascists become what they are, is they say, oh, these people are responsible for like social ills. That's often what you see happening. You see it with trans people, where they're like, you know, hey, I'm a leftist, but like this trans stuff is ridiculous, and that leads them into the pipeline. It's like transphobia literally so easily leads you into the pipeline of like phrenology. It's like you're here and then you're there, like you're doing race science. So it's like, you know, it's unfortunate, but it happens. But you also see the opposite happening as well. You see far right people getting turned into communists every day, and that's pretty cool. Lawyer Samaya, no. No, sorry. Lawyers do some stuff that is cool sometimes, but no. I could never be a lawyer. Disabled people can't get married without their benefits getting cut. Yeah, that's true. And it's so ridiculous. This system is so anti-human. It's insane. And like the horrifying thing is that literally, like, we are all like just one accident away from becoming disabled or becoming homeless, or like we are all like literally, we're not separated from these people at all, and yet society treats them like as like a social ill, or like they have like something morally wrong with them, when it's like, dude, we could all be disabled, or we could all be homeless, and so we have to like, it's not that we need to treat them well for the sake of like society treating us well if we were to ever be in that position, but it's like we should have a society in which people who like, you know, encounter misfortune, or people who like are, you know, born a certain way, are not treated as lesser literally because of factors that they cannot control. Like, ridiculous. What is your voting politic in two-party system, like using tactical vote versus abstaining? I'm registered as a Green Party voter in the state of Texas. However, in Texas, it doesn't matter what party you're registered as. You can vote in one primary. So I voted in the midterms in the Democratic primaries, and then I voted as a Democrat in the general elections. I'm of the opinion that voting is like a political activity that you can do, that is ultimately pretty meaningless, but you know, it may stave off like some horrible future event. So it's like, okay, let's vote. It takes long, but like, you know, I'm a college student. I don't have other stuff going on, so like I can deal with that. The state is selling all its responsibilities to contractors. Is this an example of cannibalism? That's an interesting way you phrase that. I don't know if it would be an example of cannibalism so much as just like garden variety, I guess, privatization. But it's hard because when the state sells off its like resources and services to private contractors, those private contractors are now liable to make a profit. And when you have the profit motive, that always becomes priority number one. So like the state sold off its responsibility to healthcare, and now we have a society that is more unhealthy than ever. The state, sold off its responsibility to taking care of you after, say, you get in an accident. And now we have a society in which if you get into an accident, you are in a worse case than literally ever. The state sold off its responsibility to, like, provide jobs to certain people after the end of the New Deal. And now we are in a situation where there is chronic unemployment. So, I don't know. If we don't vote, we'll get blamed for everything. Yeah, so I vote, but God, I do wish liberals would be less annoying about voting. I really do wish. Do y'all have strong student unions here? Bro, this is San Francisco. Absolutely not. No. No. Which sucks, but there is definitely activism. There was a protest recently, so there's some student activism that's like happening. What do you think is the solution to all this? How can we make a better world? Revolution. Revolution, revolution, revolution. We are not going to legislate. We are not going to protest. We are not going to call our representatives out of this situation. The entire system needs a massive overhaul. And honestly, the main reason why is because of climate change. Like, you are not going to have a system that does not exploit the earth so long as capitalism is still in the picture. So, do you ever feel hopelessness when trying to create change? I don't think of it that way. I think of it as we're in this world. I would like to see a different world. If that world is ever going to happen, there is activism that needs to happen, right? So, it's a very practical calculation for me. It's like, I'm not really, I'm not doing the math to figure out, what do our chances look like? It's like, well, there's that one saying that, like, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The other best time is now. It's like, yeah, we're doing activism now because I don't want to regret having not done activism later. Do you think capitalism is imploding it? I do. All the statistics say it. We're reaching a level of wealth inequality that we haven't seen, that was like surpassed the French Revolution. We're seeing wealth inequality that has surpassed like the Great Depression. It's like it's pretty bad in America, and in the global system as well, which is why you're seeing a rise in fascist movements across the planet, which is very typical of sort of an imploding capitalist system. Do you think we need a strong socialist labor party to build a vanguard for revolution? I am a major centrist on the issue of a vanguard party. I'm so sorry. I'm an anarchist because I would prefer an anarchist revolution. However, if there was a Marxist-Leninist revolution, I would also be extremely happy with that. Like, I'm such a centrist. I'm sorry. I feel that revolution is too dramatized. Most people think it's just protest. Here's the thing. People don't realize that they're in revolutionary times until they are actually in like the revolution. Like, when you see examples of like, revolutions throughout history, it's rarely when people like get together and actually say, we're gonna do XYZ, overthrow the current system. It's like, that's rarely the prevailing narrative. There's always like people who are getting together and saying something needs to change, and then they have enough discussion as they're like doing revolutionary action to get down to the basis of their problems, which is fundamentally the system needs to change. The entire system needs to change, right? The Americans, the early Americans, didn't set out to create like a constitutional democracy. That wasn't their goal. Their goal was, oh, we need like, less taxes from the king, we need more respect from the king, and we need them to kind of leave us alone and go back to their policy of salutary neglect. And then as they were in the midst of doing all that protesting, eventually it just got to a point where like, no, we can't do this anymore. So I think honestly, like, a lot of people think that a revolution is going to be people all getting up together and saying, we're marching because we're trying to build a socialist system. That's not really the case, in my opinion. What I think we'll see, and what we're already seeing, is a process in which people are saying, well, we're obviously not seeing the current system working. Like, we need the current system to change. We need it to become humane. We need it to become more socialized. And as the government and as capital fights vehemently against that, we're going to see people start to say, okay, then let's just burn the whole system down. Which, again, you're already seeing happening. I like that saying. If I could go back in time, I would try to create socialist students in school. I think that's a good, what is an anarchist revolution? It's insurrectionary in nature mostly. It's decentralized. There's a lot of individual action that you can see. Most revolutions are started by anarchist action or by individual action. Oftentimes they organize themselves into sort of a hierarchical, more vanguard-like structure. Again, I'm such a centrist on the issue of the Vanguard Party. I really don't care. I'm more so focused on like anti-capitalism. Peter Cormejo wrote a good paper on how to make revolution in America. I'll have to check that out. You imply a good point in your Pool Piker vid. Sock Dems are the new libs. Yeah, unfortunately, like, a lot of people appeal to conservative logic when there is no reason to appeal to conservative logic. Oftentimes they're just trying to like get a dunk. What I find is that it defocuses the narrative from what it really should be, which is that like, oh, human beings are like being attacked in this dehumanizing system, so like let's deal with that. I wish we can all come together and stop purchasing things we don't need to hurt corporations. If that is truly what you wish, then mutual aid is definitely necessary. Obviously, like, there's the phrase, the revolution I'll support is the revolution that frees the children, and that is 100% true. If we want our revolution to be successful, we need networks of mutual aid that are effective and that can replace like the current capitalist system. And you're already seeing them like popping up. Like Cooperation Jackson is one that's really that's making strides in trying to create an alternate economy, or at least lay the groundwork for what an alternate economy looks like. So yeah, the only acceptable centrism, well, yeah, exactly, like I'm such a centrist. I'm confused with the CCP government. They promote class consciousness but got a lot of issues. I don't know what you're saying, sorry. Revolutionaries always get whitewashed. Like our biggest one, Tammy Titi, was a Maoist, and I didn't even know because it was hidden from the public by the media. Yeah, that tends to happen. MLK as well. There was recently a report that MLK, his like famous criticism of Malcolm X was like almost entirely fabricated. So it's like we have this society which like tends to make like revolutionaries who are revolting for like the good of the people out to be like people who are just trying to reform the system, or people who are ultimately on the side of the system, and that's ridiculous. How can I find a mutual aid, I guess, organization locally to help? honestly, like, the internet is a really great tool. There are several really great organizations. Like, Extinction Rebellion is a really good one that I know is international. Food Not Bombs has an organization in every single country in the world. Most of the ones I know are American, but like, those are two really good international ones. Would food banks be considered mutual aid? There is a lot within the UK. Yeah, I would say so. It depends on It depends on how they're structured, because sometimes they're more so organized in the form of aid, of charity rather than aid, and charity is more so with the intention of perpetuating capitalism rather than subverting it. Are you a third worldist? Yes. Yeah. My parents are Nigerian. I go to Nigeria. So yeah, like, I'm super, like, third worldist. Do you keep tabs on international conflicts? Yes. I will say it's not my specialty. I'm not the greatest at analyzing international conflicts oftentimes, but I am aware of them, Opinions on anarcho-capitalism. Don't even ask me that. I'm gonna get pissed off. ANCAPs are the bane of my existence. Yeah. ANCAP is all in the name, lying about being anarchist. Exactly. It's like, you can't be an anarchist if, like, it's so stupid, because anarchism is all about deconstructing hierarchy and getting rid of hierarchy, and yet they're pro-capitalism, which is the most hierarchical thing you could possibly ever have, with, I guess, the exclusion of the monarchy. But, like, capitalism is just the perpetuation of, like, the neo-monarchy, essentially. Where it's like, oh, I got my gains from, like, exploiting third world workers, and I'm just gonna pass, like, my entire empire down to my son. It's like, that's literally just, like, that's, like, just a monarchy or the aristocracy, just without the justification of, like, the mandate of heaven. So it's like, it's so stupid. HBO Anarchist, that show, I swear to God, like, actually ruined my mood for an entire week. It was like, because, like, they're trying to show anarchism. It's like, it's crypto anarchism, and I hate crypto so bad, dude. I hate the damage that it has done to the anarchist reputation. It's so annoying. It's just libertarianism. It's not even, it's just, it's so annoying. It's so irritating. I hate it so bad. The mandate of heaven has been replaced by the myth of meritocracy. Exactly. And, like, even when you dig down into, like, what exactly is meritocracy, what are you actually talking about when you say that I got here by, like, my merits? They're still talking about, like, the right of kings, basically. Like, they're just saying, oh, I'm just built different. And ultimately, it just comes back to, like, it was just how God created me. It's like, you're not even talking about anything different. It's literally just the monarchy copied and pasted, but they just use, like, more secular language from the onset. It's like, it's so ridiculous. It's so irritating. I just, anyway, but there's like, new version of feudalism just dropped. Like, actually, no, it's like, it's really frustrating. And what you have, another thing that annoys me is that you have a whole bunch of people who are trying to be entrepreneurs. Like, they're like, oh, I'm an entrepreneur. Oh, I'm a market capitalist. I'm starting my own business. And it's like, dude, we need plumbers. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But it's like, we need electricians. Like, the trades are literally dying. So it's like, come on, man. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur. Literally, not everyone should be an entrepreneur. Like, we should have, like, the entire sectors of the economy that are literally just controlled by the state, and, like, you have, like, a federal jobs guarantee or whatever. But it's like, obviously, capitalism will never do that, and so that's why capitalism needs to be abolished. Because, like, you can't small business your way out of, like, a trade shortage, right? Why should others limit themselves to trades? What do you mean? because like the trades are a vital part of the economy? What? Why should others limit themselves to trades? What a question. It's kind of like that question is like, why are you entitled to other people's work? It's like, well, because I'm a human being in society, and like the whole point of society is to make life easier for people. What do you mean? Are you concerned with your safety as an activist in a police state, even like cybersecurity? Yeah, I have taken some steps to try to mitigate it, but ultimately it's kind of fuck it we ball hours. So Maya is not my real name, so like there's that, but you know how it is. Instead of being anointed by God, it is being anointed by the moving hand of the free market. Exactly. Yo, crypto libertarians when the free market stops jerking them off. Like, actually. Okay, but why would I give up my life for another person's happiness? See, this is like what we run into constantly. The issue of like, do you think your job is like your life, actually? Because like, the reality is we only need 4 hours in a working day. It's like, so the 4-hour work day, 4-day work week, that should not be your entire life whatsoever. It's like, for the basic maintenance of society, yes, there are some things that you're gonna have to do that are unpleasant, but like that's literally how everything works. It's like, if you want to maintain yourself as a human being, there are going to be things that you have to do that are unpleasant. So like, you as an individual are an extension of you as a society. No, I'm just saying that nobody should work a job that they do not enjoy or feel fulfilled with. Here's the reality. You're gonna inevitably do things in your life to maintain society that you don't like. Unfortunately. There are obviously ways in which like you can try to counteract that, ways that you can make work more pleasant, ways that you can like rotate around responsibilities so it's not the same person having to do X unpleasant job every single time. But it's like, ultimately, if you want a functioning society, which is what we all desire and what we actually need as social animals, you're gonna have to do some unpleasant shit. Capitalism can create those small businesses to fill those plumbers, landscaper, etc. Okay. Listen. Listen, if everyone wants to be an entrepreneur, nobody wants to be a worker. The reason they're all doing entrepreneurial stuff is not because they want like the freedom to do their own worker like sensibilities. It's literally because they like hate being a worker. They understand their exploitation under the capitalist system as a worker, so they want to become a capitalist. And the capitalist is defined as a position in which you don't do labor. So like, being like a small business owner and trying to like get away, being a small business owner and trying to like provide jobs in which you do like plumbing and stuff, that is not like the best way in which those jobs can be fulfilled. Under capitalism, it's the worst working conditions. Exactly. Like, you have people out there working 12-hour shifts every single day. Zero reason why that needs to happen. Like, there is literally a cap on the number of doctors that can be certified every single year in America. But like, doctors are overworked to the degree in which they are. So it's like ridiculous. Anyway, guys, I'm gonna head off for the night. This was really fun. You guys are like awesome. Will I chat more about my time seeing Angela Davis? Certainly. I was super inspired by her. But I am tired now and my voice hurts. So I'm gonna head off, guys. This was really fun. I'll see you guys later.